Tonight we're looking at the steel frame house and restoring a Koenig, in the sense that a Koenig is a type of house. But before we do this, because I'm a very good citizen, we have to acknowledge credits, and I don't want to get arrested by the Getty police. And all the drawings you will see are from the Pierre Koenig collection at the Getty Research Institute, and all the black and white photographs are from the Julius Schulman collection at the same location. Almost all the color photographs are mine, one or two are not, and other work which are by other hands are similarly credited. So, now I've said that, I think I'm safe. So where do we start? I think any talk on lightweight steel frame houses, which is what a Koenig is, will start with the case study house program, which was introduced in January 1945 by the editor John Entenza in his absolutely amazing magazine called Arts and Architecture. And the idea of this program was that the magazine would promote model houses, model in the sense of something to which one should aspire, model houses for post-war living. And from 1949 to 1960, all the houses that they promoted and published over the 11 years or so, all had steel frames. And this, I think, is very indicative of the direction in which John Entenza was hoping to push domestic architecture in California. They're all in Los Angeles. They're all steel frame houses. And you can see them all here. CSH, Case Study House, 8, 9, and one for 1950 that didn't get a number, 16, 17, 18, 21, and 22. And you can see who built them. And the two that perhaps we're interested in tonight, although I'm only going to talk about one of them, are the two here by Pierre Koenig, Case Study House 21 in 1958, and the follow-up, and probably now better known, Stahl House, Case Study House 22 from 1960. So, who was Pierre Koenig? He was born in San Francisco. His family moved down to Los Angeles when he was a child, and he, after war service, I should say, he served in Europe. After war service, he studied architecture at the University of Southern California, and very soon set up in practice on his own. The two houses that he's best known for are certainly these two case study houses. But as I said, we're only going to be talking about one of them. And in fact, before he built these two houses, he'd done a handful of steel frame houses. He did a house for himself when he was still a student, Koenig House 1. The Scott House, the Lamell House, and the Squire House all came in 1953. And then the Burwash House and the Biedermann House on 1957. Biedermann never got built, at least not in this form, and I don't think it got built at all. But the other ones certainly did get built, as you can tell from the photographs. And the reason two of these sets of photos are in color is that these are the houses that we're going to be looking at this evening, together with the Bailey House, or Case Study House 2021, the Seidel House, and the Johnson House. And I've split the talk into 5 themes, and each house in a way represents each of these themes. The Scott House of 1953 represents decay, because it was pretty decayed when I went to look at it. But now it's been restored, and very beautifully. However, I don't have any pictures of that. So this is the before example, if you like. The Bailey House, restoration by Koenig, number 2. Number 3, an addition by Koenig, in fact, various additions to the Seidel House. And number 4, the Burwash House, did have an addition by Koenig, but actually had a bigger addition by a very good California architect, Jim Tyler, who was one of Craig Elwood's associates. And then finally, the Johnson House, which is the house we will end with, and that's the one that went through the most extraordinary rebirth and came out, I think, as a really very, very beautiful piece of architecture. So we start here at the Scott House in Tahunga. Tahunga's just north of, on the north edge, I should say, of Greater Los Angeles. It's essentially a desert environment. And when I went there, this photograph was taken on the 14th of February 2013. At that time, I was working at the Getty Conservation Institute doing a study of just these sorts of houses. And part of the fun of it was going out to look at them. So on St. Valentine's Day, I turned up here, and it was incredibly hot even then, which is not surprising. But what is surprising, that I then have found a photograph showing the house under snow. And that's probably very, very rare. But there is Edwin Scott holding his child, and the house is up on the hill behind. He was the original owner, the man who commissioned it. The house is very simple and very straightforward. The motor car in California, of course, is nearly as important as the people. So the house has got a big room for the motor car, which is that open porch at the front. And then the bedrooms are to the right with bathrooms, and then across the back are the living spaces. On the left, the living room; in the center at the top of the plan, the dining room; and to the right, the kitchen. And there's a patio out back. And what I think is interesting about this house, and indeed all his early houses up to Case Study House 22, I think that was the first one, he uses circular section columns. And this allows him to be flexible with his roof beams. And if you look at the roof beams on this house, you can see that they go in two directions. For want of a better description, the east-west ones are long and cover the carport. They need bigger spans. And the shorter ones, north-south, cover the domestic accommodation to the north end of the building, which actually I think is the west, but don't let that worry you. And here are some of examples of the tubular steel columns. And why should these be so interesting? And I think the reason is that once you're building a frame with tubular steel columns, when using I-section beams, because that's by and large what they were using, you can allow the beams to go east-west and north-south together, and you don't get any awkward junctions, particularly with the columns, because the column being circular can accommodate a beam going in either direction. And you can see in the drawing on the right from the Koenig archive, you see a series of plans on the top showing the beam up against a fascia, the beam cut into the edge beam, the column up against a fascia on the left, column cut into an edge beam, the column standing proud of an edge beam, and column in a corner situation. So the relationship between the beams and the columns is very flexible. The moment you start using H-section columns, which is the sort of thing Mies van der Rohe used at the Farnsworth House and Philip Johnson used at the Glass House at New Canaan, Connecticut, you get a problem, because you've got to have all your columns lining up the same way, which means that your beams can only go in one principal direction as well. Otherwise, you get ridiculous junctions that don't work. But here with a circular column, I think there's something quite clever going on. However, he was to reject those with Case Study House 21 and move on to a more conventional use of columns. So there's a perspective drawing in the archive, which you can see at the top, showing pretty much the view in the photograph, and the perspective view at the bottom is the living accommodation at the rear of the building. This is not a pitched roof house. Don't think that for a minute. It's just a very sharp, perhaps accentuated two-point perspective drawing. Koenig wouldn't do pitched roofs. So that's the room which is shown in the perspective drawing. You can see the fireplace in the drawing, you can see it in the photograph, and you can also see a box in the wall for logs. And there's a working drawing of that room showing the various elements and the position and the sizes and so on. I'm going to show you now the fireplace in the dining room, as it was called on the first plan. And this is the fireplace on the left-hand side of the section. It's not exactly as you see here in the drawing. It was changed a little, but nevertheless, that's the one they're showing. And what interests me about this is if you look at the drawing carefully and look at the notes, it says stone veneer. And well, there isn't any, is there? There's no stone veneer on this, in this building. These are quite simply concrete block walls. And I think the message there is that the aesthetic of the architecture, as we've come to appreciate it, of very clean lines and sharp edges, was not actually the original intention. This idea of having a more rustic facing to the walls, a stone veneer, was the first thought. Anyway, that didn't come about. And I don't quite know why, but I suspect either they ran out of money. Edwin Scott, who was doing the building work, he was managing the project, possibly thought it was unnecessary, and maybe Koenig even agreed that it looked a little bit too rural, and he wanted it a little bit sharper. So, decay. The building wasn't in a very good shape when I went to see it. There was all sorts of stuff that had gathered on the roof, such as solar panels. There were various penetrations made through the roof decking, such as you can see here, vents. And once you put things on the roof, once you put vents through the roof, you compromise the water protection which the profiled metal decking provides. And so badly did this building leak that they covered the roof with a thin layer of concrete. And that's probably what you're looking at there. And it's messy, and it's not really very effective. And in the restoration work, I understand all that has been removed. And on the left, there's a photograph, and you think the roof is collapsing here, there's a big hole in it. Well, actually, no, that is meant to be a gap, but something has certainly gone a bit awry to the right-hand side of it. It's starting to look very worn and torn. That gap is meant to be there because directly below there's a planter. So this is how you get some water when it does rain on the planter. If you think it never rains in Southern California, you're quite wrong. It certainly does. As you saw, it snows. But that's no reason for leaving out suitable rainwater goods. And this is an adaptation which probably looks familiar to you from other buildings you've gone to see, which need care and attention. This building was 60 years old when I went to see it, so I think it's probably done okay. And to stick a bit of plastic tubing on the bottom of a rainwater dam pipe is probably not too bad an idea. At least it will stop the rainwater flooding the building. But all that needs to be attended to. There's a drawing there showing what the roof section originally was like. It was very thin, insulation, 1 inch of Celotex. I mean, even in Southern California, that would be not enough. In fact, you need more to keep the heat out rather than to keep the warm in. But details that you can see there are fairly common: a gravel stop and gravel on the top and so on. But after 60 years, as I say, the building was looking pretty worn and getting really rather tatty. So these are just some photographs of corners, edges, doors, columns and so on, where you can see that whoever took it on was going to have quite a challenge to smarten it up. The plan in the middle is the plan you've seen already, and the red box indicates the area shown in the plan on the right. This is the entrance walkway. A photograph on the left is looking back towards the entrance from the living room end of the house. But what I'm wanting you to pick up on is the planting and the paving, all that sort of cosmetic. It's not really cosmetic, no, that's wrong. That essential stuff that provides an entrance and sets up a pattern, a quality, a standard for the rest of the building. And all that has pretty much gone. These photographs show that car parking area and the entrance walkway to the left. The planting's all gone, the paving's looking pretty messy. And you can see the hole in the roof that I pointed out earlier, and you can see how it is lined up with the planter on the right-hand side of the plan on the screen at the moment. So what else has gone wrong in this building? After 60 years, there's been a certain amount of change. This is the dining room, D on the plan, but if you look at the larger plan on the right, it's now called the loggia, or loggia, and beyond that is the patio. The floor of the loggia is quite clearly a gridded, tiled floor, but when we go into the space itself, it's got crazy paving, which of course would have gone well with the stone veneer that they, in the end, never put on the walls. So where the changes come, I don't know. Maybe Edwin Scott didn't follow Pierre's instructions, or only followed some of them, put in the crazy paving because he thought that was nicer than the gridded floor, but he then didn't put the stone veneer on the wall, which would have complemented it. Anyway, we don't really know, but the point is, this is not a building as Pierre would have left it when he left sight for the last time. There's a view from the back end of the fireplace looking through the length of the dining room onto the patio. And if we go out into the patio, the left-hand photograph is looking to the left on the drawing across the patio, and the right-hand photograph is looking to the right. And again, I think it's all looking a little bit sad, a bit shabby, not least the planting and so on. But you know, here's a house that is on the edge of decay and certainly needs some attention. So we go to the second building, the Bailey House, which was built for Mary and Walter Bailey. This was not the first scheme that Pierre Koenig came up for them. He did a slightly earlier house in 1956, but it was too big and too expensive, so it was reduced in size. But here we get the rigor of the plan, the columns all in line with each other, H-section columns, the beams all I-section, all going across the plan. I'm not going to show you a plan with lines on it, but you can imagine what it's like from these illustrations. These are Pierre's own drawings, of course. And then the house went through a couple of owners, and a man called Edson Newquist purchased it. He was a New York man. He was in the graphics industry, advertising, and he came out to California and thought this would be the place for him. But I found these two posters that he did for the Renault car, or the Renault, as the Americans would say. And I like this, Le Car Hot, Renault Dauphine. On the left-hand one, if you read L'économie, get up to 40 miles per gallon, go on a weekend trip on one tank full of gas, use the savings to buy things you've been putting off. I mean, it's a great way of trying to sell a car, isn't it? La Proclamation, or La Proclamation, as they might say. We, the drivers of America, want a car that is economical, quality built, comfortable, portable, handsome. We demand a return to the car. Well, it's all good stuff. And he was clearly a modernist at heart, and he got this house. And I met him there in 1988. And this is what it looked like at the time. These are my photographs. The ponds that go around the house have clearly dried out and probably haven't had water in them for a long time. There, on the right-hand top photograph, there's a panel that has fallen off. It's a little door that has fallen off the end of the vertical cladding on the walling there to expose all the electrical boxes on the inside. Inside the house itself, he's installed, or somebody before him maybe has installed, a freestanding log-burning stove. The kitchen, which is just discernible as a white wall behind the stove, has been pretty much reduced to a counter, and a hole has been cut in the ceiling for a roof light. So here was a building certainly in need of repair, attention, and some loving care. There's a very well-known photograph by Julia Schulman, and I'm using that just to compare it with a photograph I took showing that interior. It's a slightly different one to the one you've seen. And although my color slide was old, I think the building was also looking a bit murky on the inside. It certainly didn't have the crispness and the clarity and cleanliness, and the cleanness, I should say, of that photograph by Julius. And there's Julius promoting his photograph. We went there with the 20th Century Society group in 2004, and Julius was the most amazing host. He just loved to talk about architecture and show people his pictures. And there he is showing that photograph, and it became the cover picture on a magazine, Interior Design. But, as John will show you later perhaps, it is also the cover picture in a very fine book, which I did for Taschen a few years ago. And I went with my postgraduate student, Barbara Lamprecht, and with Pierre to the house, and we revived or reposed the famous photograph. That's Pierre in the top right-hand photograph. And the bottom right-hand photograph is a famous Hollywood couple who I will not name, but I gather are no longer married. And the house was bought up in the late the late 1990s by a man from the film industry called Dan Cracchiolo. And he's the guy with the baseball cap on backwards. And there's the house, as it looked pretty much when he bought it. He's an interesting person. I wouldn't expect, somebody from the film industry to be taken in by a house like this, but he clearly was. I think he thought it was fabulous. He was executive producer on the film The Matrix, co-producer on Exit Wounds, high quality romantic cinema, you'll note. And what did he do? He got Pierre in there, and he got the house pretty much restored back to its original form. There's an original photograph on the left and a photograph I took showing it in its restored condition on the right. And you can see, if nothing else, there's water now in the pools that surround the house. One of the big difficulties was rebuilding the kitchen, because all these old kitchen units from General Electric, such as you see here, and these were catalogues from Pierre's own archive, these were just not available. There's the old kitchen that you can see on the left-hand photograph. So Pierre went to town and redesigned a new kitchen with new equipment and a series of drawings, fairly simple drawings, as you can see here, all in feet and inches, because America hasn't discovered metric yet. And it works. It's almost exactly the same size as the original kitchen. It's not the same materials, it's not the same look, and it's not the same fittings. Anyway, there's the plan, and there's the elevation, not of the side you see in the photograph, that's the side just outside the photograph to the left. That side you see there. So there we get a new kitchen, a 1998 version of a 1958 kitchen. So it's about 40 years later. And looking at the same kitchen unit from the other side, you can see he's returned it to its original arrangement, shall we say, a low wall with a work surface behind, a long service hatch, and then an enclosed cupboard above. And that's a freestanding unit, pretty much freestanding within the box that makes up the room. The sitting space is in front of it, in other words, behind the camera. The entrance to the house is on the right. Behind the kitchen unit, there's a dining area with a circular table. And through that door on the left, there's a small internal courtyard with a couple of bathrooms off it, or shower rooms, and then beyond that are the 2 bedrooms. Oops, wrong way. Another thing that had to be recreated to make it right was the cadenza, which Pierre designed again. And you can see the specifications here, the materials. Stereo cabinet for case study house number 21. And there it is, the new version up against the wall in the house in its original position. Dan Cracchiolo was a good client and was interested, and he kept on sending notes to Pierre, such as this one here. Pierre, here's a rough idea of the desk-like design. This also shows the magazine shelf. So he'd cut this out of a magazine somewhere, and he wants a horizontal desk and a shelf set at about 40 degrees just above it there, and then bookshelves above that. And this is what he got. He got it in the dividing wall between the 2 bedrooms. Behind those sliding walls, when you slide them back, you can see he gets the bookshelves, he gets the desk, he gets what he wanted. And it doesn't compromise the house. It is not original in the sense it wasn't there in the original design. It was just an upgrade, and it suited the client's needs and demands. And in 1999, the house, which had been there already for 40-something years, was declared a historic cultural monument, number 669, and it got this crest, as it were. I don't mean the crest was stuck on the building, but I put that in to show the city of Los Angeles has finally come to approve this house. And looking at the records of that sort of listing process, because that's really what it was, a number of visits were made and statements had to be given and explanations written and so on. It was quite a thorough look at the building, and it's really nice to think that Dan Caracciolo managed to bring it up to that standard. And it's particularly sad then to know that in 2004, he was killed in a motorcycle accident while going down to the corner store to get some milk for his breakfast. So poor Dan Caracciolo had died, but before then he'd sold the house to a man called Michael Lafetre. And Michael Lafetre was and is one of these people who loves to buy up great architecture and restore it or even live in it. And he did live in this for a while, and then he found it was too difficult with his partner and however many cats they had. So he eventually moved on. But over the next 2 or 3 years, he continued to restore the house. There were some things that hadn't been done that needed to be done, but the general effect was absolutely there. You can see the water in the pool, you can see the streams of water coming off the roof. No, it's not been raining. There's a pump that takes water up pipes to these spouts along the eaves, which then shoot it out back into the water. And on the very right of the photograph of the house, you can see a door has been replaced in that cupboard for the electrical meters, the door which had disappeared some time. The thing that Lafetre concentrated on, it seemed to me, was this fountain. It's in the little inner courtyard that separates the bedrooms from the living space. And there's a series of faxes that Pierre sent to Michael Lafetre, just as you see here on the right, showing sketch drawings, his initials, the names of the installers and so on. And there's the item itself. You can see it through here, looking from the living room into the courtyard. That's the wall where water presumably would run down and create a cooling effect. And you see the red dots on the wall there. You can see one in the big photograph, a number of them in the smaller picture. And these even were planned and worked out exactly where they should go. I wonder if the mosaic master moved one dot a little bit to the left. Would Pierre have noticed? I'm not sure. But it's all very accurate stuff, isn't it? And the detailing, the sense of a complete building even extended to the mailbox, which stands on a post just outside the building. And there's the mailbox for Case Study House 21, house number 9038. And there's Pierre on the entrance pathway on the occasion of one of my visits to the house with him. So we come to the Seidel house. Tom Seidel was a builder. He was a developer. He did work with Pierre. Pierre did work for him in the sense that Pierre designed buildings such as this, which Tom Seidel built. But they also sort of became involved together with one or two development programs, particularly restoring old buildings down in Venice, California. So the Seidel house, 1960. It's on, can't remember, something Canyon Road. The road is to the right of the photograph, and the ground rises up steeply to the left, as you can see in Pierre's drawing. And that's what it looked like when it was finished. It's quite large, it's quite big, comprising 3 parts, essentially. The part nearest the camera, number 1 in this drawing, is the living part. The part down the back end is the sleeping part, and the part in the middle, which is mostly open, is the entrance part. There's a small entrance hall where the number 3 is, but beyond that, which is outside the blue box, is another internal courtyard space open to the sky and indeed open to the roadside. And it wasn't very long after that the house was sold to Lorraine and Stephen Valenci. And Stephen Valenci apparently was Thomas Hadel's lawyer. I think I've got that right. And they did two pieces of work to the house. The first was down at the front end where you see the kitchen, and it was to move the kitchen end wall out towards the camera. And the second was to redesign the entrance space in the middle. These are the two red boxes. So here's a house that was 5 years old, and the kitchen was apparently too small. So it gets moved out a very, very short way. I'm looking at the drawing to see exactly how far it was moved out, but I can't now remember. Something like about 6 feet. It seems an expensive operation. But you can see in the photograph there, it's enough space to contain a table and chairs, and the wall, the original wall, would have been under that beam on the right-hand side of the photograph, so it gets pushed out to the edge of the roof, which sort of makes a bit of a nonsense of the shading that the overhang would have provided. The next thing that the Valencis did was to redesign the entrance hall and create a small den or study, which you can see in the plan there. And the door now comes in on the right, and you turn sharp right as you come through the door and enter into the sort of passageway that connects the bedroom wing to the north to the living room wing to the south. So the Valencis eventually sold the house to Della and Gary Rowley, who I think are still there. And they've changed the house considerably over the years. The first Rowley addition, 1984, bearing in mind there's not much space outside the house, the only way to go is up. So they went up, and they built a new story on top of the living room kitchen wing to the south, and a second story on top of the den. They took out the den and turned that into a staircase, as you can see here on the left, and the new bedroom wing on the top. One house sitting on top of another. The columns come down. In this photograph, you can see the columns come down proud of the existing structure. And this was all done by Pierre. He had a great sense of ownership. He had keys for all the houses he designed in a key locker in his office. And he took me out to this house, and he opened the locker and he got out a key, and off we went. And I said, will they be there? It doesn't matter, I've got a key. And apparently the Rowleys, soon after they'd been there, probably a few weeks, Della Rowley told me that this white Porsche drove up the driveway and parked outside the house. And this man came to the door, rang the doorbell, and she opened the door and said, yes. He said, hello, I'm your architect. And like, this is my child, and I'm not having you messing around with it. He didn't say quite that, but that was clearly the inference. So whenever they wanted to do something, they referred back to Pierre, and it was a very close and warm relationship, which was, frankly, really just as well. The second Rowley addition, 1994, involved closing in the courtyard garden, creating a 3-story space, which you can see in that drawing on the left, and then putting another story, second story, on top of the bedroom wing. So here we are looking down into the now enclosed garden space, and this is from on top of the living room kitchen wing as it is. And then the drawings on the right there, again from the archives, of course, show how he went about this. Looking up into that space, there's a big fan on the ceiling, which you can't see. The windows at the top do open to get ventilation through. And the photographs on the right give some indication now of how the house has grown and developed. Bits and pieces, small bits and pieces were moved. The cupboard on the right, in the top right-hand photograph, contains the boiler, and that used to be positioned more or less in the center of that opening. So that had to be shifted across to make the link through to the courtyard space more manageable. And here's a detail, again showing how one new building is made on top of another one. In this case, these columns are extended upwards, and they're welded, and the weldings are ground down, but they don't seem to have ground them very far. But this is the nature of this house. You're always aware that you're living within the frame. This color scheme brings this out, of course. Grey steelwork, white walls, or darker panels in the walls sometimes. So onto the Burwash production house. Why is it called a production house? Pierre had this idea that the factory-made house was the future. Walter Gropius had the same idea. Both of them were proven wrong. I think Pierre was proven wrong largely because he couldn't get anybody to support him. He couldn't get factories who had been making cars, who had been making aeroplanes, ships, and things like that for the war effort. There's a lot of that going on in California in the 1940s, so into the 1950s, here were these factories that could have turned their production lines to making steel houses. He couldn't get them to support his ideas. But the production house, or the Burwash production house, built for Henry Burwash, was really an example of how this could be done. It's a building that is flexible, and this is really the key to all these steel houses. You can move them, I don't mean move the house, you can move bits within the house, you can move the walls, you can move the organs, as it were, within the body, and it doesn't really matter. You can extend them horizontally, you can extend them vertically. It's a language, an architectural language, which is, I think, infinitely flexible. And this building had two additions and a certain amount of moving around inside. The original house is the left-hand bit in the photograph. I tried to hide the first edition behind the bushes there on the right. Not totally successful, but anyway, you get the idea. The garage was just behind where these bushes are on the right-hand side, where you can see the car. The perspective drawing shows pretty much the same, not quite the same angle, but pretty close to the angle in the photograph. And there's the plan on the right. Absolutely straightforward. About 8 columns along the front. I say about 8 because I'm not counting them very carefully. And 8 columns along the back, and beams running, as it were, north-south. And it is north-south in this particular example. We're back in Tahunga here. And Tahunga, as I said earlier, was this pretty much desert climate. And you can see that in the landscape in the background. The wall on the left-hand side, where it says den, is a solid wall. You can see that in the photograph. There's no windows at all. And that's because it's the west wall. And what you don't want in this climate is a low evening sun blasting in through a window on the west, because you just cook. On the right-hand side, at this stage, there are no windows on the right, although even though there's a hill there and the sun will be shaded to some extent, I don't think there are windows on the right-hand side in this earlier version of the house, but they came in a little bit later. And the entrance is just a bit off-center between the kitchen and the den, and that takes you through rather nicely to the center of the house, off which to the right there's a passage going down towards the bedrooms and bathrooms. And then Whitehead, Bruce Whitehead asked Pierre to extend the house, 1965. It's interesting, these owners don't actually stay there very long. It seems to they get turned over fairly quickly. So Bruce Whitehead's extension is the bit in red on the right. And what I've managed to do with, I think, a degree of success, but not perfect, is superimpose one drawing upon another. So there's Pierre's extension drawing. And you can see he introduced a family room at the bottom, another bedroom, and some bathrooms along the right-hand side. And these are the rooms that have high-level windows on the east. But as I say, with the big hill there on the east, the eastern sun is perhaps less of a risk. And then, here we have elevations of that side, the eastern side, showing the high-level windows. It says west elevation. wonder why it says that, because that should be the east elevation. There aren't any windows on the west, unless these might have been the windows on the left-hand side of the plan, the left-hand side of the new family room and the bedroom. I suppose that could be it. However, the point I'm trying to make about the windows still stands. And then Jim Tyler, who was, as I said earlier, the associate of Craig Elwood, comes in and does extend the house. And he does this for Beth Cristales, who bought the house in the later 1990s. Why Beth didn't go to Pierre, I'm not sure, or why Pierre didn't do the job had she gone to him. It's probably because he was becoming increasingly unwell. He died in 2004 from leukemia, and I think he was taking on very little work in the last few years. What Jim Tyler did was to extend the house down, taking the old, or the second carport, which had been at the bottom of the first Pierre extension, taking in that carport and converting it into accommodation. And you can see in this photograph the glazing that goes all the way down there, 3 extra bays of glazing for that new room. And here's a couple of views, one looking back up the entrance corridor towards the house, that's the left-hand picture, and the other one is looking into the new family room that was at the far end of the Jim Tyler extension. But it's all in the manner of Pierre. I'm not saying Jim copied his detailings, but he used the same materials, he used the same aesthetic, and it all fits in very, very nicely. Jim also did a few changes internally. He extended the kitchen which had been pulled back originally under the eaves, got pulled out to the front. Again, I might question this, I might question this because the eaves are not providing any shade from the southern sun, which is what you need. Okay, so the kitchen comes out, and you can see that in that photograph that it's pushed right forward. And then to the side of the kitchen, between the kitchen and the den, or between the entranceway and the den, sorry, not quite yet, that's the back end of the kitchen, the old passageway that goes through towards the bedroom and the other wing. And then to the side, between the kitchen and the den, or as I say, between the entranceway and the den, there's this fireplace. Here's Pierre's original conception. The view is one would never get because it's taken through the west wall, and one's standing about 10 feet behind the west wall, 3 meters behind it. A wall you can see through, yes. But anyway, Jim tidied this up, shall we say. The original drawings there by Pierre show this as a unit of gridded blocks, but Jim decided to cover the whole lot in render. It's quite possible this was because the blocks were cracked or something like that. But nevertheless, we still get this large mass that sits within the building with the fireplace, but also extends out to the outside. Provides a suitable separation between the entrance doors, you can see in the photograph there, and the sitting area just out of sight on the other side of the fireplace unit. And so we come, probably just about on time, to the last of these buildings, the complete rebuild. And this is the house that Pierre built in 1961 for Elizabeth and Cyrus Johnson. It's in a place called Carmel Valley, which is not Los Angeles, not even greater Los Angeles. It's up near Monterey, about 2/3 of the way, maybe halfway, no, maybe 2/3 of the way from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And it's a hilly area, it's very dry. It's an area of farming, an area of winemaking, and so on. And this is the sketch design for the Johnson house. You will note a swimming pool on the right, which is in a way the purpose of the house. It wraps itself around the swimming pool. And the idea for this particular house came straight from case study house 22, the Stahl house, which is L-shaped, as you can see in this picture, and also wraps itself around the swimming pool. But the Stahl house, although pool was built there, at the Cyrus Johnson house, the pool was not built, and the open space remains to this day. But nevertheless, one gets an understanding of the building and the arrangement of it if one thinks back to the case study house 22. Well, you'll have to think very hard because I haven't shown it to you, but that doesn't matter. This is really an L-shaped L-shaped plan with a wing sticking off to the west, and you can see that just sketched in at the far end of the perspective. West has been to the left. The building under construction in 1961, Pierre Koenig, AIA architect, Los Angeles, in other words, from the big city. And I love this guy's name, Charles R. Strathmire, probably Scottish, a general contractor from Carmel Valley, now building custom residence of steel and glass. And so it was for a while. And then this happened. The next owner, James Murphy, got a local architect, Donald Wald, to alter the house, to bring it into line with all the other timber houses in the area. He didn't really want to have a steel and glass pavilion. He wanted something more cozy and cottagey. And so we get this. It's clad in timber, externally vertical cladding. It's got a little oriel window you can see to the left of the door, on the other side of which there's a window seat. It's got a nice pitched roof porch. It's got extended roof beams, which you will gather are totally unnecessary because it's already a steel frame inside. And it's got, just behind the attractive lantern there in the bushes, it's got a porthole window. This was the house which Cynthia and Fred Reeby saw when they were looking for somewhere to buy in about 1987. They'd been touring around. They wanted a modern house, and for some reason they ended up here. Fred was so put off by the building, he refused to get out of the car. But Cynthia got out, she went in. It was an open day. This is how you sell houses in America. You open them up and lots of people turn up and hopefully somebody wants to buy it. So she went in, and I guess people milling around, and she saw that the back of the house had these huge glass plate windows, completely contrary to what the front showed. And laid out on top of the piano there were some architectural drawings. And Cynthia was an associate of the American Society of Interior Designers. She could read a drawing. She could recognize the graphics. She knew this was a modernist house designer, but she hadn't heard of Pierre Koenig. So Fred was encouraged to come in. And, well, you can sort of see what they saw. What they saw was probably the color pictures. What they might have seen had they been there when the house was finished were the black and white pictures. What has happened to the house? I don't want to talk about the ducts. I don't want to talk about the furniture, because that would be just rude. I want to point out that the profiled metal ceiling was covered with rough-cut redwood boarding and painted. The fireplace with its steel frame was covered in maybe ceramic tiles, I'm not quite sure, but tiles of some sort. That the, a fan was put in the ceiling, and of course, I forgot to mention that. That the window was pushed, a little box window, the oriel window was pushed through the wall, as you can see there, with a window seat. There was no floor-to-ceiling glazing in the front of the house. In fact, there hadn't been before, but nevertheless, a window like this wasn't really part of the aesthetic. That new doors were all paneled with large knobbly brass handles, nothing slick and sliding, as you might see in the original photograph on the left. It was a very extreme unmodernization of the building. And this is what it had looked like when it was finished. The photograph is taken from the bottom left-hand corner of the plan, looking up at the house. The swimming pool would have been on the other side, but it was never put in. The wing that sticks out to the left in the photograph you can see on the plan is really carport and workshop. So the house essentially is a L-shaped building. So they found this name, Pierre Koenig, on the drawings, and Fred did some research and located Pierre down in Los Angeles. And he phoned him up, and I said, "Are you Pierre Koenig?" And yes, well, I'm interested in your architecture. And Pierre makes some comment, "Everybody thinks I'm dead." So, and indeed, it probably felt like it. And really, the Rebys came to his rescue, and I think gave him a new lease of life. And he flew up, and he was incredibly upset with what he saw. And the solution was essentially to strip the house right back and start again. But the Rebys had a couple of children. They were aged about, 4 and 6, something like that. And they'd been watching American TV, and they thought this architect was Mr. Conehead, which is one of the TV characters as opposed to Mr. Koenig. And designs started to emerge. Here's a very early sketch by Pierre. Okay, we'll get the workshop and garage wing, turn them into bedrooms for the kids or guest bedrooms. And the rest of the house, it was really a question of, I won't say tidying it up, but of course it was that, but really just returning it to its original configuration, but adding also to the north a wing that would provide a carport, CP, at the top. Now, because Cynthia was interior designer, she spent a lot of time exchanging ideas with Pierre. 28th November, this drawing, exactly which year I'm not sure, probably 1988. And more drawings by Cynthia, churning out the stuff. On the right it says, late, mostly junk. I think many of us know what that feels like, working on a plan at 2 in the morning, thinking, I really should go to bed. I'm not getting anywhere. So Cynthia had this wonderful working relationship with Pierre, and all this material, all her drawings are in the archive. And I should say, sorry, the bottom pictures on the right are 3 different versions of the kitchen. Indeed, bottom left is also versions of the kitchen. The kitchen backed onto the utility room, and the question was how to make the two work together, where to put the doors, how to avoid the kitchen being a shortcut between one wing of the house and the other, so as to stop the children running through at high speed just when you're getting the food off the oven or something like that. And Cynthia went through all these designs, and the one that came out pretty much as the preferred version was the bottom right-hand photograph. And I'm talking here just about the kitchen. I can't now remember how you get into the utility room. I think it is actually on the other side. And Pierre's drawing showing the kitchen arrangement, and there on the right, the kitchen as it was finished. If you look at the right-hand side of the photograph, you're looking at a mirror, and you're actually seeing a reflection of the kitchen. That is a sliding door which you pull back, and then the passageway goes through to the 2 kids' bedrooms. But this was a very, very comprehensive job, and Pierre's going right back to the elevations. Full drawings for pretty much everything, as you can see here. And when the house was finished in 1989, it looked like this. I went to stay there in 2014, I think it was. And I think I've never stayed in a house that I admired so much. It was really wonderful. And I wandered around with my camera. I took millions of photographs. I climbed a tree down the end of the garden to get this picture, and then found I couldn't get out of the tree. Sorry? Yeah, right. Well, would have taken them a long time. I eventually jumped, hoping I wouldn't break a leg. But I think what a house. Just 2 views of the L-shaped courtyard where the swimming pool might have been, but is not. I think Pierre was always wanting the Rebys to put in a pool, but they resisted. And we get a sort of Japanese garden of sorts. they'd spent a lot of time living abroad, a lot of time in Japan and the Far East. And I think that comes through in the furnishings, in their wall hangings and so on, and certainly in the way the garden is treated. These are two views from opposing corners, if you can follow that one, looking at the same central space. The main living room got returned to what it should have been. There had been a, I think it was walnut panelled wall on the left. That was now changed, and the solid grey wall you can see is its replacement. The fireplace, slightly different to its original design, but nevertheless more in keeping than what we saw in the coloured photographs. And then a bedroom on the east side of the house. The Reeby's master bedroom is just beyond that. When I say this is a bedroom, it's a sitting space. But this is where the window had been punched through the wall, where the audio window had been put through on the left, where the shelves are, which was sort of so much at odds with the nature of the architecture. And this is the room I stayed in, and it was just wonderful. I didn't want to go to sleep. And my room was in the new wing, which had been the garage and the the garage and the workshop. So I was in behind those sliding doors you can see in the left-hand photograph. So I think if there's a message from what I'm trying to say is that these buildings offer wonderful spaces, wonderful flexibility, and they don't have to be all sitting in wide open sites like this one. They can be very tight and very compact. They can have internal courtyards. They're a model that can work well in urban settings or indeed in rural settings, as you get here, as long as the neighbours don't object to getting something very modern amongst all their timber-clad cottages. So I'd really encourage you to go and see some of these if you have never had that chance, because it's an architecture well worth seeing. So thank you, and we haven't quite finished. If you want to read more about it, there's this one, and there's the new edition of that old book, which is just the same but with a different cover. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that fascinating updating. I don't know, Tom, do we have questions in the chat that people want to read out, or shall we start with questions here?
Philip and Neil, yes we do. I've got a couple of comments. I've had a comment from Christopher Pescu, who has asked, are these houses mostly... Could you come to the front and read those? Could you come to the front? Sure.
Not to cut out people who are here. I mean, if you want to raise your hand, we'll make sure you get your question in if you've got one. After.
Perhaps you could introduce the question to Neil.
What should we? Right, I'll read it out slowly and rather difficult, and you can do that. Are these houses now mostly used as show homes, museums, or are they in private ownership and used as dwellings? Have some of the reservations been faithful to the original materials, systems, or where the sustainability credentials for upgrading? I can imagine that they performed very poorly in both hot and cold weather and probably make for very uncomfortable dwellings.
Okay, well, the first question, are these houses mostly used as show homes or museums? No, they're used, as you suggest, as private dwellings. Case study house 21 rather, is the only one that I know of that is used as a show home or a dwelling, but it might not be anymore. It might have returned to sort of regular occupation. It was bought by it was interesting, Case Study House 21 was bought in an auction as a piece of artwork in Chicago it wasn't a house sale auction. It was being auctioned as one might auction a Rolls Royce or a Picasso. And it was bought by somebody from South Korea. And the house was used really as a showroom for furniture. And that was the case when I last went there, but I'm not sure what the current state of that building is. The Stahl House 22 is certainly used for visits, and I think, well, certainly you can go and see it. I think it's quite expensive, but maybe I shouldn't say that. It was lived in when I saw it, but then Mrs. Stahl, Carlotta Stahl, was still living there. Maybe one of the children are living there. Again, I don't really know. But I think the impression I get is that these houses are almost all still serving as domestic residences. The Scott House, as I said, has been bought up and restored very beautifully. And the new owners, of course, are there, are living there. The climate, well, there's a lot that can be done with high quality insulation and so on. I always feel that if it gets a bit too hot, what you can do is open a window. This seems a slightly antiquated view, I understand. But if you open a window at one end and another one at the other end, you get air movement. And hopefully, if traffic noise is not too bad and there's not too much dust around, it is not altogether an unpleasant experience. When it gets cold, and it doesn't get particularly cold in Los Angeles, it gets cold, it gets chilly. The more you're out in the desert, as it were, as opposed to the city center, it does get chilly. I remember putting on the fan in my house in reverse, and the theory I had was that it would push the hot air down. It didn't seem to make any difference at all. But anyway, the other way of dealing with houses that are thinly insulated, if it does get cold, is to put on more clothes. You know, you don't have to go around in a pair of sandals and flip-flops in December, although I think half the Southern Californians probably still do. So I take a slightly hard-line attitude about the environmental qualities of these buildings. I think one can do a lot to make them work without getting too involved in the changing of the architecture.
Right. Are there other questions there in the chat?
We've lost the chats.
How do we get the chats back?
John, we've lost the chat. They're getting me. Are there any questions from the floor?
Oh, yes.
Yes, can I just say,
James.
I'm a bit puzzled by the numbering system of these houses. There are gaps in them. And I thought that Neutra, for example, had done a case study house. Does
Yes.
it feature on your list there?
Well, firstly, my list was steel houses. Neutra's was timber. These are all steel houses. And the thing about the case study house program is that when it was introduced in 1945, most of the houses which were designed over the next few years were not built. Case study house 9 was the Eames house, and 8 was the Eames house, 9 was the Intenza house. These were almost the first ones to be built. Neutra has a house just round the corner, I mean quite literally on the driveway that goes up to those houses, and that's timber. So the numbering sequence is very odd. Soriano's house didn't get a number at all. It was just the house from 1960. And the series carried on till about 1965. Sorry, Soriano's the house from 1950. The series carried on till about 1965, 5 years or so after Pierre's second house. Yeah, don't try to understand the numbering system because it doesn't make sense.
So the steel, it wasn't compulsory to be steel. I mean, although Intenza liked the idea of steel houses, he was ready to accept Neutra's timber house in the canon, as it were.
Yes, initially, but then I think he got very close to Charles Eames. Eames designed the Eames house and the Intenza house with Eero Saarinen, the Intenza house. You know, he'd bitten the steel bullet and he enjoyed it, so he was going to go with steel for 11 years.
Yes, could I ask something about that? I mean, Koenig came out of the army, didn't he, World War II, along with others, and did his training then, is that right?
Yeah.
So there was a distance between the pre-war architects in California, many of whom built very much in timber, and Neutra had trouble, didn't he, painting things silver. The desperation to get things modern and shiny and steely. Could you expand a bit on Koenig? Do you think that having him been through in the surfaces in the wall before becoming an architect, that in pushing forward the way he wanted to design on his dining, is that something that's noticeable about that generation?
Well, I think it is. Even before the war, Koenig had been living in San Francisco, going to the docks, drawing the ships and things like that. He'd already developed an interest in industrial forms, industrial architecture, if you like. At school, he was always drawing aeroplanes and gained quite a reputation as an artist for these things. So then he joins the military, gets a fast track training, which was meant to be an officer's training, but that got cut short because of the D-Day landings, although he wasn't part of that. And he went over to France after D-Day and was on active service through to the end of the war, going with the US Army through into Germany. He got invalided out at one point. I can't remember what had happened. He didn't get shot or anything. He fell over and hurt his leg or something. But it's slightly mysterious exactly what was going on. There's two different accounts that appear to contradict each other, both of his. So you can look at my book and try and work out what I thought happened. He claims he was at one of the concentration camps, might have been Belsen, I can't remember now, when it was liberated. But I don't think he was. I think he was at a sub-camp that used the same name. But it wasn't a very nice experience either way. Being in the military with all that machinery, I think it certainly had an effect on the way he saw things. But when he went to study architecture at the University of Southern California, he was being taught to do things in timber. That was the language. Whitney Houston, no, she's a rock star. Whitney Smith, that's the name. Whitney Smith. The Pasadena School, as they called it, a way of designing buildings in timber, which actually looked very like the Koenig buildings in steel. That was what they were being taught to do. And he sort of thought this was a bit ridiculous, and he did the same type of house in steel and got himself into all sorts of trouble. You know, he'd been the top student, and then he did his steel building in some project and got flunked for it. You know, they weren't having it. So the staff were very much against that sort of thing, and he reckoned about the only way he could prove his point was to go and build himself a house, which was the first house that he built, the Koenig 1. So he was certainly, I think, a product of the post-war years. Craig Elwood was really very much the same. He'd been in the military, although he'd never actually left California. He was guarding the airspace above California from something or other. But, you know, he also got drawn to the steel forms. And, you know, I think, again, that was a post-war realization.
Okay.
Neil, we've got, I just
Yes.
noticed one or two people trying to raise their hands at the front. Are you still interested in?
I think, well, Philip asked pretty much the same question, so...
Okay.
I'm trying to look here in the chat. There are a couple here. There's Colleen asking if you could choose any one of Pierre's houses which to live in, which would you choose?
Oh, which one would I live in? The one you
Yes.
see on the screen, without
Yes.
any doubt. The Reby house or the Johnson house. Yes. I even wanted to ask if I could move in, but I felt that was too presumptuous.
Okay, well, that's the answer to the question, I think. There's another one from Abe Haim. Flexibility. It makes the Farnsworth and Philip Johnson house look rather stiff and rigid. These ideas should still be pursued. Is the Walter Siegel and his timber-framed self-build a relevant idea, but using timber in keeping with the climate changes?
I think the Walter Siegel timber houses are certainly relevant. They have a good deal more flexibility than the Johnson house or the Philip Johnson House at New Canaan, or the Mies Farnsworth House at Plano in Illinois. But I do think that steel is a much more useful material. It is sustainable. You can use steel again and again. Of course, you're thinking, but what about all that energy and melting it down? Okay, but one could make an argument for the use of steel. Timber has its benefits, but also has its difficulties. And in a climate like ours, it perhaps needs more care and attention than a steel house would.
Okay. Can I put one in now?
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of use of steel frame, there was one that he did which originally was a single-story house, and then he put a second story on it, but rotated the second story through 45 degrees, which seemed to be taking, the cube and what you could do with it steel in a direction. I'm not sure what happened to that house in the end.
Well, that's the Schwartz house you're thinking of.
Yeah.
And it looks like it's got a rectangular box, square box at the bottom, and then a square box on top, which is turned through 45 degrees. However, it's got an external frame. So the frame is all round the outside, and these 2 stories were the original building. It was not like he added another story. And the lower one is square to the street to make that relationship, and the upper one is turned through however many degrees it is, to give a view down the canyon towards the ocean, and also to bring in the cool breezes. So that was the reason that was done. And the steel frame sits on top of this with 4 big round columns. And one of the columns is, because the building is turned, is sort of off grid, as it were. And around that column, Pierre put the helical stairs. So the building kicks out at the back to take in one column, and that's where the stairs are going up to the upper floor. That house was built for Martin and Mel Schwartz, who lived in it for a while. I got to know them very well, and they eventually moved to Carmel Valley, as it happens, where this house is, and had a house built for them there by, and I'll forget the name of the architect. But what I do remember, which was much more fun, was when Martin and Mel Schwartz took me for dinner in a little Italian restaurant just down the road in Pacific Palisades there on the edge of Santa Monica. And guess who came and sat at the next table? Clint Eastwood. Oh, and then he was joined by...
he was mayor, wasn't he?
No, that was in Carmel. He was joined by, oh God, what's the actor's name? Who was married to, it doesn't matter. Anyway, it was, for me, somebody from this country. It was very exciting.
There's another question coming here from James, not our James here, another James. Given today's technology and also the need for housing, what do you think needs to be done to educate manufacturers and local authorities in the possibilities afforded by factory-constructed houses? In addition to these basic frames, could easily be incorporated with 3D on-site printing techniques. Your thoughts, please.
What can one do to educate manufacturers and local authorities? Well, what can one do to educate local authorities? That's a question in itself. Manufacturers, I think if there's a market there, if they perceive a market, they would go that way. But the trouble with so many, what do we call the houses built by housing companies, commercial housing. The trouble with that is the clients, the public, only buy what they're offered. And because they buy that, the builders say, well, that's what they want. They don't really have a choice. And we have this antique system, what I would regard as antique or primitive, of bricks and mortar and welly boots and mud and all the rest of it. And there must be other ways of building. You can do a brick wall very effectively in a factory, as as has been done. Michael Hopkins used to do that, maybe still does. So I think there's a lot to be said for factory-made buildings. They don't have to be steel, but steel is a relatively easy and lightweight material to move around, and they do offer opportunities.
Tunji Falaye, these are excellent houses, well worth visiting. I have seen the Stahl house and I've seen the Eames house. I suppose he's asking really how easy it is to see others these days.
It says perhaps Docomomo field trip to sunny California. Yes, well,
yes,
I'm sure that will be
cost,
fun.
Cost quite a bit. Yes. Yes, do. Sorry, please.
Did he, in his efforts to get production of housing out of factories after the war?
So I can't hear you, sorry.
In his efforts to get production out of factories after the war, did he actually develop any designs for that? Did he work on any...
For production houses?
For out-of-factory houses?
Yes.
He did?
Masses.
Oh, excellent, right. And
Yes.
by the book of...
They're described in my book. I can't remember how many variations. Pierre got involved with a Native American tribe at Lake Havasu, right beside London Bridge, which is where it is. And he wanted to do a housing village for them. And he developed these modular houses. Now, they're in the desert. It gets incredibly hot there. But, that was okay. He worked out how they worked, how they would operate. And you could get 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, L-shaped, rectangular, whatever. They all had right angles, nothing with a curve. And, that was his demonstration of how it could be done. It didn't happen. The funding wasn't made available.
To hear that that's the case.
So I can't hear you.
It's fantastic to hear that's the case.
Yeah.
That excites me greatly because I was hoping that's what you would say.
Chemehuevi, Chemehueve, Chemehuevi, Indians at Lake Havasu. Yes.
Neil, can I just ask you about the listing of buildings in Los Angeles? It struck me that if that building was listed, it was something like 669. That's incredibly few buildings have legal protection or had legal protection at that time in Los Angeles. So what hope is there that many of these buildings will survive in some kind of state that they were designed to be in, that if subsequent people buy them and decide they're going to, I'll change this and I'll change this and I'll do this, that California will lose that legacy?
I think that's a very good point. They are at risk. Of the 8 case study houses I showed, the Eames house is still there. That's pretty much preserved. The Entenza house has been built on top of and isn't worth seeing. Case study house 16 is still there by Elwood. Soriano, house from 1950, is gone. Since I've seen it, it's gone. Case study house 16 by Elwood is still there. 17 is gone. 18 is gone, or altered beyond recognition and painted pink. And then we get the two Koenig houses, both of which are there. But the 2021, the one that we talked about in this lecture, has been rebuilt, as you're noticing, and something else was rebuilt again in the last few years for reasons I don't know. I've rather lost track of that. But these buildings are at risk, and if it is a straight numerical sequence up to 669 or whatever it was, it does make one wonder how many buildings have got preservation orders on them. They might have local preservation orders as opposed to City of Los Angeles, and I don't know, maybe there's a bigger authority, the state of California, for instance. I'm not that familiar with the listing process over there. But yes, these houses are certainly at risk. The property is very, very valuable, and the houses are small. You're not going to spend $10 million on a plot of land with a garage on it. So you knock down the garage and put something bigger. And you're from Tokyo, I know this, and in Japan, the house as an object has little value. It's the land that has the value. So people keep the land and rebuild and rebuild and rebuild. And I think that sort of situation is apparent in California. All these small houses on big plots get ripped away.
Could I ask a question slightly related to that? It seems to me that if Koenig hadn't come along and altered these houses, that perhaps they would have been lost, years ago. Did he mind altering the houses, or did he see them from the start as something that could be kind of future-proofed? Or alternatively, did he only extend them himself to prevent other architects doing the same thing?
I think he didn't mind them because of that last reason. So he didn't mind changing them because it would stop somebody else coming in and messing them up. Jim Tyler, he thought a lot of. Michael Lefebvre, who was the second owner I showed you or third owner, I guess, of Case Study House 21. Michael Lefebvre then commissioned a house from Pierre right on the coast at Malibu. But Pierre died. But before he died, he made sure that it was Jim Tyler who was going to finish the house. And Jim wrote me a letter after my book came out, the second book, emphasizing that he had really designed this house and most of Pierre's ideas had gone. But that was okay. But I think, as I said, Pierre regarded these houses as his children, and he didn't want them to be mistreated. And if somebody was going to do something to it, it was going to be him, if anyone.
Have you had any chance to compare these steel houses, for example, with Michael Hopkins's steel house in Downshire Hill, which is under British building regulations?
I haven't made a real comparison of it. That's got a lot of glass on the garden side. It's fairly solid on the two flanks, and I can't remember quite what the front looks like. You enter by a bridge.
Yes.
Yeah. I've got a message here from Cynthia Reeby in California, who says, "Fred says to tell you that your bedroom is still available." Thank you very much.
Oh, I think that's probably a good note. Good note to end on. Thank you very much, Neil, for your talk.
Thank you.